Welcome to another edition of Geopolitics and Empire. Quick reminder, as always, I'm always in need of your support, and the best way you can do that is by becoming a paid subscriber on the Substack. I produce a weekly analysis of world events and also schedule off-the-record calls with supporters only, where we come together every week or two to support to shoot the breeze on world events. You can also purchase a consult if you want to chat with me, donate through the website, check out my affiliates, leave podcast reviews, and all that good stuff that I remind you of on every single podcast. And for the first time, we've got joining us, I'm a big fan of his work, and it's great to have him on the podcast, Michael Every. He's a global strategist at Rabobank. He analyzes major financial developments and contributes to the bank's various economic research publications for internal and external customers and to the media. Zero Hedge often publishes his material. He's got over 2 decades of experience working as an economist and strategist. And before Rabobank, he was a director at Silk Road Associates in Bangkok, senior economist and fixed income strategist at the Royal Bank of Canada in both London and Sydney, and an economist for Dun & Bradstreet in London. He holds a master's degree in economics with distinction from University College London and speaks a smattering of languages, including Thai. Welcome to the podcast, Michael.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming on. And, I've been reading your stuff for years via Zero Hedge, and then sometimes directly from the website at Rabobank. And then for the first time recently only, I saw your face when you popped up on Ralph Scholheimer's podcast. He's been a guest on Geopolitics and Empire, as well as most recently Mike Shelby, who was also on the podcast, and Adam Taggart, whose work I very much enjoy. You were there recently. And so I thought I've got to get you on. And maybe to start, I like to ask my guests their big picture view, sort of your theory of everything regarding where we're at in this moment. So many things are in flux. I and a number of my guests tend to think we're in this interregnum, like between world wars, and the Bretton Woods system is breaking down, and everything's breaking down. And we're sort of in the thick of it, the fog of war, the gray zone, and it's unclear what comes next. And so maybe to start, what's your sort of take or pulse on where we're at?
Yeah, I would completely agree with that assessment. I try and come up with a literary quote, usually something quite pithy at the beginning. And maybe a while ago, I would have said something like, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, and try and quote Dickens. But I think just about everyone agrees it's the worst of times now. So that's largely irrelevant. Even the people who have been doing very well out of the present system are now waking up in panic and realizing that it's not sustainable the way it is. So yeah, interregnum is a good way of putting it.
And maybe on the Bretton Woods, sort of my idea has been that the World War II order is now breaking down. All of these institutions, IMF, World Bank, WTO, and the dollar reserve. You had the gold-backed dollar reserve, which some people say ended in 1971, and then from there we were on Bretton Woods 2.0, the oil-backed dollar, and some people are saying now that that's done, and we're looking to Bretton Woods 3.0. And so where do you sort of, and then there's all this talk of de-dollarization, the rise of the East, multipolarity. What are your thoughts there?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. I think as an overarching statement, yes, things are changing very, very significantly. And what was is not what will be. I think we can all agree on that. What will be, however, is open to question. There's a very broad spectrum of opinion, and it is an entirely political judgment. This is no longer something that you can just look at a spreadsheet about and say, well, clearly it's going to be X. I think it's a very large part of the answer still. Maybe I'm biased because I've spent so many years looking at spreadsheets. But in terms of how one interprets them or what else one projects forward from them, it's a political view. So obviously you have people saying this is the end of the West, this is the end of the dollar, this is the end of fiat money, we're going back to gold, we're going to Bitcoin, we're going to crypto, everything's going to collapse, buy shotguns and duct tape and build yourself a bunker. And you also have people saying, no, everything will continue exactly as it was, and all it will take is a few rate cuts and getting rid of Donald Trump. And suddenly all of our problems are fixed and the system will just naturally heal itself. And I think there's an awful lot of self-serving politics in all of those views, that people generally tend to project what they would like to see and what would suit their own book. And I mean that right the way across the spectrum, from Wall Street to Occupy Wall Street. People will tend to project what they think is going to happen will happen. But it's very much open to question. I know what I think will happen, but I don't think it's written. I think you're looking at a dice game where the dice are heavily loaded in one direction, but you can still get a very surprising outturn, which could shake everything up.
Well, feel free to go, I guess, further on that point. What's sort of your thoughts on where we might be headed?
Sure. Well, I'm sure talking to your audience, they're cognizant with a lot of what I'm going to be throwing up here, which is that you can absolutely argue that the present US dollar-centric, Western-centric global system has had its day in the sun and is now fading. And just looking at the headlines that I wake up to this morning here in Asia, there's just more and more evidence of that. At the same time, when you're saying one thing is failing, you have to be able to logically say what's going to replace it. What is a stable structure? Otherwise, your call for what's coming next is very different from just saying, okay, not the dollar, therefore X. Well, if there is no other X, then potentially you're either looking at global anarchy and real chaos, or the alternative is to just stick with what we have, even though it isn't very good in some form. And having lived in 9 different countries around the world, being based in Asia now, but knowing, a fair slice of it fairly well, albeit with large parts I will never claim to know, Latin America being one, Africa being the other. It's very hard to make a case that there's anything emerging which can work for everybody in the same way that the US system has until now, and still is, even if it's fading rapidly. So my view is that without a replacement that's pre-packaged and just sitting there waiting for you to take it off the shelf and rip open the box, we are probably still going to see an extension of the dollar system going forward. But I think it's going to be quite radically different in some ways from the one we've had up until now. And I think a lot of people are really going to dislike it. And for once, I don't just mean the people who have been on the wrong end of the dollar system in emerging markets, for example, or what we call the global south. But I mean people within developed economies too. I think a lot of the West is not going to like the way this new dollar system works. But I think the US as a whole, US Inc., if you will, if not Wall Street, will.
To go further on that, because I interview folks just as you laid out from across the spectrum, collapsologists like way back in the day, cultural historian Morris Berman, who wrote a trilogy on the collapse of U.S. empire. The late Johann Galtung, who just passed, had him on twice, where he's predicted collapse of Soviet Union. He said this year would be the collapse of American empire. And I don't know, kind of like yourself, I'm careful, and I can see different scenarios coming out. And one scenario kind of that I've had is maybe what you're alluding to. And I just want to get your further thoughts on what this looks like, what you're talking about. And I feel like part of that is related to what they're playing with this Bitcoin and Bitcoin strategic reserve, and it's sort of extending the dollar, maybe dollarizing the world. And I feel like either it's going to work or it can fail and blow up in their faces. And so if you could just tell us a bit more about what you think this extension of the dollar could look like.
Sure. Well, look, it's rather abstract, and you have to go back a few steps before you can get to that answer. Let's begin with this statement, and I think we'd all be in broad agreement on this. Certainly the Trump White House would as well, which is that the model that was of the US at the center of a global system, which was based on US financialization, and I don't have to define that, I hope, rather than industrial production, which created inequality within the US and echoed across most of the West and most of the world, and inequality between countries, where some emerged as new centers of production with a large trade surplus, and others became large net importers with even greater polarization domestically as a result. So you've got this difference between countries and you've got this difference within countries. That system is collapsing. That's absolutely, my central view. And I predicted that a long time ago alongside, many others from many different fields. So if that can't stay, the dollar system has to adapt. And the key question to my mind is, if a financialized dollar just completely goes the route that you've seen many overextended currencies have in the past, and the historical track record on that is very clear. And I fully understand the people who see that, and obviously they back gold or they back something in crypto that's real rather than the dollar. Or whether the US can use the legacy of the massive financial power that it has now and financialization, which still carries some weight. I mean, it's definitely going out of date, and it doesn't do anything good for the US as a whole, but it still carries impetus for the moment because that system is still there in the background. Whether it can use that, leverage it to try and create industrial production again. So whether it can re-industrialize itself, whether it can effectively become the world's most powerful emerging market by saying we want investment in the US in the right kind of things. We want blue collar jobs in the US. We want to make things again. In the same way that most emerging markets for decades, and quite rightly, have said, well, why don't we have any value added industry? Why do we have such a rather unhappy workforce, which is either not very well paid, apart from an urban elite, which are always enjoying the best of the West, and everyone's just trying to struggle to get by. And that describes a lot of the US now too. So if the US can do that, it will have to change the dollar system. So it'll have to move away from financialization, as I said, back to industrial production. But it'll have to do that within a system in which the entire flow of financial assets and people who buy the dollar and the reasons they buy it are all related to financialization. So the emerging consensus at I don't want to say it's left field, because I think it's actually becoming quite central, but it's still at the fringes of market consciousness, because your average Bloomberg screen reader or financial market analyst or economist is just not really cognizant of what's going on here. They don't know their financial history. They don't know how things actually work, in the same way that fish don't realize they're in water. And therefore, they can't understand the principle of changing water for something else, and how rapidly you'll have to evolve and become an amphibian in that environment. But what they're talking about doing is, officially they're talking about a Bitcoin, some kind of strategic reserve. That, I believe personally, is largely going to be used as a vehicle for leveraging up to borrow more. So if they can manage to push Bitcoin from X to 10X, you can then borrow 10X against your stock of Bitcoin. So you're still just using financialization there. And then the question is whether you use it on consumption, at which point will the last one to leave please turn out the lights? Or whether you use that for physical investment in infrastructure and capital stock, in AI, in robotics, in factories, et cetera, at which point the US is back with a bang after an inflationary period getting there. So that's Bitcoin. That's how I think that would work. And in terms of the other thing that sits alongside that is dollar stablecoins, which I think are going to emerge too. Now, this gets rather abstract. So let me just try and sketch it out as briefly as I can. As far as I see it, and as someone who's never been a big fan of crypto, to be abundantly clear, I used to call it crapto. If you're going to issue these dollar stablecoins, they are some kind of electronic, crypto solid currency, which are backed by dollars, which are fiat, which is a kind of a contradiction in term. It's like gold backed by dollars, but nonetheless, that's what they're going to do. But the discussion is, under a new trading framework, trading, security, and financial framework that the US is trying to get its key partners to agree to, which is renegotiating the entire global system in real time in the background. That's what these trading deals they're trying to do are all about. They're not just about tariffs, which is the most simplistic, naive take that you hear about it. They're trying to agree with other countries to say, right, from now on, when we build a sympathetic system where we have much more of the production again, but you have parts that you didn't have until now, so it's a more equal relationship. When you sell to us and you earn dollars, we want you to recycle those dollars, not into US treasuries or into US stocks, which push up asset prices, make the rich richer, and increase debt in the US. We want you to put it into stablecoins. Now, if you do that, to a certain degree electronically, you start understanding where they are because you can track them. There's a certain kind of coding to them, which is preferable to not knowing where they are, like wads of cash in North Korea, etc. But secondly, and this is, as I said, rather abstract, but stick with me just for a little while longer, when you have a trading and financial relationship between two countries, one country's surplus must be the other one's deficit. And the financial and trade situation also mirror each other. So I run a large trade surplus with you, and I run a large capital deficit with you because I put my money in you, because with the money I've earned from you, it just recycles back to you. Everything has to balance within the accounting system. Well, if you create these dollar stablecoins, you create a new pocket into which that capital can flow. It's a new asset. And again, you can borrow against that in the future. But if it flows into that, it doesn't create debt. You're creating a new avenue. Now, technically, is it a debt? Well, who to? I mean, then you get philosophical about, is money debt? Who's it owed to, etc. But you're literally creating new dollars de novo, pretty much physically printing them, except they're crypto, so therefore they're not being printed. And if people are holding those dollar stable coins, you start to create a new ecosystem within which, as I said, you can monitor things more closely and make sure that everyone stays inside the corral. So we know who is producing what and where, and in a more balanced manner. And last point, very quickly, people aren't talking about this enough. In fact, they're not talking about it at all. But again, if you look at how the balance sheets work, surplus, deficit, trade, capital, if you are going to narrow this all down and create this pocket which doesn't create debt, the other corollary that has to go alongside it is a reduction in inequality. Because the current system sees the top 1 or 2 income deciles in every country, including the US, getting nearly all the pie. You know, for decades that's been true. You can't have that situation and narrow your trade deficit and reduce the other country's trade surplus, which is just as unequal, by the way. So that needs to come down. So as they come down and you create this new system, you actually have to look at the bottom 4 deciles. So when you describe it like this, and I hope I've done a good job, but I fully understand how complex some of those moving parts are for people who aren't familiar with them. You're actually sketching out a system which is incredibly different from the current one, radically different. Wall Street would hate it. But for all that people think Trump is this, corrupt orange billionaire who's just feathering his own nest and dealing with his own family, and, there are valid allegations along those lines, absolutely, don't get me wrong. At the same time, you are implying a much fairer, more balanced global system, which in many respects would tick a lot of the revolutionary boxes from, some of the posters I can see on the wall behind you. So it's a really bizarre situation we're in now, where you've got the far left pushing back against Trump, and I understand why, obviously. And you've also got I wouldn't say the far right in a nationalist sense, but like the neoliberal right, absolutely pushing back against Trump. And one of them is wrong, if you think about it in a way.
So many questions here, and you've sketched it out much better than I could ever. But I agree with you, especially on Bitcoin. I've always been skeptical on Bitcoin. There's so many questions I have here, but maybe just to ask you, the rest of the world, this word that's being bandied about, multipolarity, multipolar world, and New York Times, you name it, main papers in the past few weeks have been talking about effectively Orwellian regionalism. If we recall 1984, Oceania, Eurasia, and East Asia, right? The English-speaking world, Oceania, Russia, Eurasia, and China, East Asia. And they've explicitly been talking about, sort of this world of 3 blocks or regional blocks. And what was most you see Trump basically talking about a North American Union or technate. Putin is pushing a Eurasian Union, and the South China Morning Post just published a week ago that China is working towards a prototype of an Asian Union. And so I just find all of that stuff interesting. Your thoughts sort of on multipolarity, the rest of the world, how they incorporate into the system or react to it. There's been endless talk of a BRICS currency. Nothing has, as far as I can tell, materialized. Just thoughts there.
Sure. Okay, well, let's start with the multipolarity one. It's a fashionable term, and I certainly think you're seeing elements of it. I mean, for example, one of the key ones was the US Navy retreating from the Houthis recently in Yemen. Now, technically, can the US wipe the Houthis out? Of course they can. They can kill everyone in Yemen at the drop of a bomb. So is that multipolarity? Yes and no. It's multipolarity in that the US may not be able to do it conventionally, or at least not within the boundaries that are acceptable to Western public opinion. But they can certainly solve that problem. Can the Yemenites, or rather the Houthis, of course, who aren't all of the Yemenites, but can the Houthis manage to do the same to the US? No. So in what way is that multipolarity? It's a kind of the US versus Vietnam, in a way that the US was defeated because it couldn't achieve its political goal the way that it wanted. And militarily, there were, genuine moral constraints above and beyond what it was already doing in terms of what it would have to do to tick those boxes. But, was Vietnam then the equal of the US? No. But, but it could certainly leverage what it had to force it to retreat. So you're seeing a similarity with the past there. And so that echoes these cries of multipolarity to a degree. But equally, let's look at the currency, okay, as a segue to the next part of the question. Does anyone anywhere else in the world have anything that will be universally acceptable right now? Were the US to turn the dollar off, which it can do, it has the power to say, country A, B, C, you can't use the dollar. And they're doing that at the moment. Does anyone else say, hey, we're not bothered because we've got X, Y, Z in our pocket and you can all use that? No, no one does. So that's, again, not true multipolarity. Where the US really is stumbling is on the fact that it doesn't make much anymore. It's still a big producer, but so many of its supply chains have been sliced and diced and put around the world. And so many of them are in China, which of course is potentially, another one of these blocks, which I'll come to in a second. That yes, on that front, they have a real problem. And that links back to what I was saying a moment ago, which the US game plan is to try and say, we need to take this back. So the multipolarity thing, I don't buy it in terms of saying we now have an equal planet. I absolutely see that it's no longer the US-centric, whatever the US says goes everywhere system, but the US is still primus inter pares, as we say, the first amongst equals. Absolutely. Now, about those blocks, so the New York Times did mention that. Look, this is something I've been running with for years and saying logically, once the one global system with the US at the center falls apart, which it is, you will start seeing immediate push and pull to say, okay, well, what other potential economic centers of gravity do we have? Now, Russia as an economy, even if you're being generous, is not really one of them. It has an incredible range of nuclear weapons, which of course is going to give anyone sway globally. And it has a sphere of influence historically. And it has an enormous amount of resources, which makes it incredibly important. But as an economy per se, and with the demographics it has, would you really think Russia could run all of Eurasia? Now, maybe Russia thinks it can, but that's an awful lot of space for it to take up. And were Europe to ever get its act together, and that's a whole separate conversation, that you would say Europe could probably push back to an extent, even if it's going to cost it dearly, which is why it's not doing it so far. So you can maybe pencil that one in. The only way that one would really happen is if Europe agreed to go along with it, or if the US does everything it can to work with Russia to push Europe into it, to undermine Europe deliberately. So possibly, but it's a question mark over that one. I don't think that's an absolute given. The Chinese bloc, well, who's in that? Because we talk about the BRICS. Well, that's got Russia in it for a start. And we've had a New York Times headline again in the last 48 hours, how the Russian security services openly talk about China as an enemy. Now, anyone who knows the relationship historically between the countries will tell you that makes perfect sense, that it's absolutely an alliance of convenience at the moment, and it's genuinely really one helping the other. But an analogy I've made for years is it's very similar to when you watch a Marvel movie and you get a couple of supervillains combining to fight Spider-Man. Do they really think they're going to share the world 50-50 at the end of it? I don't think so. I think those supervillains know that as soon as Spider-Man's out of the way, that detente will break down. So that New York Times story, for whatever it's worth, I think does hold some weight there. And within the rest of the bloc, India and China, not exactly good buddies. And India is going to be a more and more important economy. Japan and China, not exactly good buddies. So where does that zone actually sit, particularly when the US still sees itself as an Asian power or an Asia-Pacific power in that respect? And the Philippines, for example, is very close to the US at the moment. So it's a movable feast, if you will. I'm not quite sure. The one that's clearest, I think, is that the US Monroe Doctrine is back. And in Canada, obviously, they've been insulted by Trump's rhetoric, and who wouldn't be? But the point I have to make on that one is Canada itself, as a country, has only had a few discrete phases in its history. First of all, it was protected by the British Empire, ergo it's safe, but it's in one bloc. Post-World War II, it's protected by the American Empire during the Cold War. And then we have a brief post-Cold War period where it can be global Canada. And it can go anywhere it wants. That's over. That globalization period is over. And there's no British to protect it. And there's no American to protect it. So, if you're projecting forward history and thinking, where are we going to be in 100 years? I think interesting question marks come up. And if the US, as part of the negotiations that are ongoing now, can tell Canada, we will set your external tariff, particularly versus China. So anyone who does a trade deal with China, we set your tariff against them. And we set your tariff against China. Effectively, that becomes like the European Union, except Canada is Greece and the US is France and Germany and Italy, all as one. So what does Canada mean as Canada in that environment over the next couple of decades or centuries? And Mexico, well, you're based in Mexico, so I'm sure you have a far more granular view than me, just how integrated Mexico is with it and how few options Mexico has if it decides it doesn't want to do that. So the US bloc, I think, is pretty clear. And then you go further south, it gets more interesting.
I mean, this has been, again, it's not conspiracy theory. I met an interview. I believe I conducted the last living interview with who was known as the father of the North American Union, Dr. Robert Pastor, and it's all fleshed out. And then you got the technocracy movement going back to the 1930s, which talked about integrating everything, and not a coincidence that Elon Musk's grandfather was a part of that. And as you know, Mexico is very much, they're building the third Costco here in town. Walmart's going to drop $6 billion to expand. Amazon's all over the place. I mean, you name it, we are integrate. AT&T has come into the market to push their ISP and so forth. Let me ask you, just on that point, your thoughts on the potential for war. Some of the guests that I've had on the past, like market sniper Francis Hunt, who believes, when you go with the hypothesis that there's going to be a collapse, then you think that, and this has been done before, I think, in history, where they'll go to war to mask the collapse or the reset, and then use that to build out new structures post-war. So do you think we're going to go through some major war, or it might be more limited? We saw the West basically hit billions of dollars worth of Russian nuclear strategic bombers recently. And so, again, I'm sort of on the fence where it may remain at a more limited stage with a higher quantity of theaters like Middle East, Europe, Asia, US-Mexico border, or it might, in a few years, boil to something much hotter. Thoughts here?
Well, again, I'm on the fence too, and I can completely understand the arguments that people put forward from all sides, except the classical or neoclassical, neoliberal market argument, which is you can't have war because it's illogical and it's bad for the economy, which is, of course, the nonsense which failed to predict every one of the recent wars that we've had, and which I did see coming in most cases. I certainly hope we don't go to that level. But what I can say is that where you are seeing clashes at the moment, and clashes is a very small word for some of the terrible violence that we're seeing. It's not coincidental, that geography. These aren't just long-running ethnic or territorial conflicts, which they are too, as an aside. They are friction points, if you will, between the emerging boundaries and resource centers and production centers of this emerging new political geography. So if you understand that to be true, it's not difficult to start pointing to the ones that are more likely or at risk of erupting going forward. And let me just give you one as an example that maybe, speaking to a North American audience here, wouldn't immediately spring to mind. India and Pakistan, of course, had serious clashes, which fortunately stopped fairly quickly too, just recently. That, of course, has slowed down any US-India trade deal, which will have a security element to it, which will have this new architecture around it. So it's not just about tariffs. It's about finance. It's about trade structures. It's about socioeconomics and who does well and who doesn't, and about security and who is funding whose military. If you're exporting to the US, do you fund their industrial production in order to maintain their military superiority? And then how much of that technology do they share with you so you can be an equal defense partner? And those discussions are ongoing in India's case. Suddenly, Pakistan, an Islamic group, which of course Pakistan has nothing to do with whatsoever, launches an attack which derails that. And you may think that sounds like a conspiracy theory. Well, we have had documents found, and I believe even more were unearthed today, Asia time, in the Middle East as part of the war in Gaza, showing that, yes, there's documentary evidence. And again, people may not choose to believe it because conspiracy theories run wild in that region. But personally, I do. And I have my own reasons for that, maybe. That there were valid geopolitical reasons why Hamas attacked Israel on October the 7th. And one of them was they wanted to stop Israel and Saudi Arabia striking an Abraham Accords deal, which was at that point quite close. So, of course, that destabilized Middle East peace in the region. And it also destabilized the potential for the India-Middle East economic corridor, which flows through to Europe. If you build the India-Middle East economic corridor, you incentivize India and the Middle East and ultimately Europe to all be in the US bloc, because the Middle East and India under this scheme would be, and therefore Europe would have to join up with it. At which point there isn't much left for the BRICS. It's really becoming relatively slim pickings. So lo and behold, we have a war which has absolutely stopped that in its tracks. So I fear a lot more of that going forward. And certainly when you see what Ukraine has managed to do in Russia in the past week or so, it's now so cheap to do this that it will be very hard to stop people doing it. And it's so expensive to stop them doing it. So the long run implications of that have not been factored in by markets at all. And yet one thing we can see, and markets are factoring in, is that defense spending everywhere is going to explode. If you'll excuse the pun, it's going to go through the roof in a system in which we already have too much debt and too large a deficit everywhere. And we now need to rearm, because you can't be the only one who isn't when everyone else is. You can't say I'm the wise one for refusing to do it because it isn't economically valid, and then be the one who gets invaded or threatened or coerced. So that only encourages the collapse of the system, because the financial system can't cope with it per se. Maybe even the societal or political system can't cope with it. And so you have to reinvent everything. And then you find out, as I said, which blocks actually can hold together better in that time of stress and which can't, which countries and which systems can take that pressure and turn coal into a diamond, and which ones just become dust.
And to your last point, drones. I mean, it's frightening, the stuff that we're seeing out of Ukraine. In my last weekly analysis, I included multiple clips of how even Ukrainian soldiers who have become prisoners of war with the Russians, their own fellow soldiers are sending suicide drones to blow up the men who have been caught so they can't speak. And tongue in cheek, I'm referring to all of this build out as Skynet becoming self-aware. Nikkei, just the other day, I read Nikkei mention how Japan, come on, Japan, you can't, China and Ukraine are advancing with drones and all these autonomous military systems. You can't be, you got to keep up. And it's kind of like, everyone's got to advance all of these Skynet effectively. And just on that theme, I wanted to circle back. Something that one of the main things I'm concerned about is this sort of technocracy or algocracy ruled by AI algorithm. I had Edwin Block on the podcast 5 years ago, and I really loved his term of, I hate this dystopia, but I think his term was my favorite, algorithm ghetto, right? Or social credit system. And, we're talking about Bitcoin, there's CBDCs. And so, again, all nations are working on these things and digital IDs. And, I've already been debanked by my own government, DHS, from PayPal. People are being, last week, Europe, Alina Lipp, this German journalist, apparently she can't. She's an EU citizen who can't enter the EU now, which is insane. So it's basically thought crime. Again, taking from Orwell, they're now implementing thought crime. Do you have any thoughts when it comes to the potential for dystopia? I mean, we've also got the Palantir stuff that's going on now, and you mentioned tariffs. I was surprised to learn that they were weaponizing tariffs. I think, for example, in Africa, some African countries, Lesotho, they were saying, we'll go easy on you with the tariffs, but you have to accept Starlink. You have to take a license for Starlink. And that's sort of their way of bringing, again, building out Skynet. Your thoughts on sort of this potential for dystopia, CBDCs and all that?
Okay, well, let me just briefly start with the last point and then answer the bigger one. As far as I understand it, Starlink's just obviously Elon Musk linked, but above and beyond that, it's just cheap internet, and he's a free speech purist. So I'm not quite sure where the dystopian side of that is. I can completely see the traditional, you have to buy this from us in order to get X bargaining, which every country in the world does, by the way, not just Trump, not just the US. But I'm not quite sure how dystopian that part of it is, just business as usual. But more broadly, I think anyone from any field, feels a certain set of unease, the confluence of the increased digitization of everything, the centralization of everything, and the introduction of AI into everything, the militarization of everything going forward. There are a huge number of very disturbing scenarios that one can draw without too much imagination. Now, I'm a child of the 1970s, just to age myself for the audience who I like to flatter myself maybe wouldn't have guessed that. But I grew up with all the dystopian science fiction movies that came out in that decade, like Logan's Run, Soylent Green, etc., etc. There's just so many ways you can spin this negatively, and there are some ways you can spin it positively. It really comes down to one's disposition, I suppose. I'm a natural cynic, and as I said, a child of the 70s who grew up with these authoritarian dystopian visions, as well as 1984, which you referred to at the beginning. So yes, it worries me intently. But it seems at the moment, and I'm quoting Yanis Varoufakis here, that we face a choice between genuine authoritarianism on one hand and liberal authoritarianism on the other, because the liberal authoritarians, in his words, see the threats to the system from authoritarians and decide the only way to deal with that is with authoritarianism. It's very hard, as I said, to be the only person who doesn't arm in a world in which everyone arms, and it's of questionable logic and wisdom. And equally, it's extremely hard to be the only one who says we are a bastion of freedom when everyone else starts moving in the other direction. Because on one hand, it's extremely attractive to do that, and I would always prefer that as an individual. I think most of us would. But when you look at the ability now of AI to create digital content, have you seen some of the latest videos where they're interviewing completely artificial people? Imagine where that's going to be in a year or two. There'll be a completely fake podcast of a completely fake you interviewing a completely fake me, floating around out there, misrepresenting our positions with a completely fake rapper. What are we going to do in that environment where it's going to be incredibly hard to tell what's genuine and what isn't, what people really are saying and what they aren't, where the wag the dog scenarios are going to be incredibly easy to generate? It's difficult to see how a completely traditional libertarian view holds up in that environment, because it's going to be chaos. Equally, does one want to go down the route of repression and qui custodia ipsos custodes? Who do you select to be the people selecting what is and isn't truth? It's a crucial dilemma we're at on that juncture. At the same time, as I said, in more traditional territory, we're at a juncture over what we do about debt levels that we can't afford to pay back, growth which we can't manage to generate, currency systems which aren't working, trade systems which aren't working, economies which aren't working equally, and even ecological systems or environmental systems which are no longer working. And some would argue demographic systems which are no longer working in terms of what the future looks like in many different countries. You put that confluence of things together and wow, That's all I can say. Just wow. Nobody has a convincing narrative to explain what comes next. And in fact, just to extend that argument just for a few more seconds, if you look within the US right now, which obviously is the easiest benchmark for everyone watching to consider, you've just seen a split between Musk and Trump. Now, maybe that's all fake. Maybe it's real. I suspect it's real, not just because of the personalities, but because Musk is a libertarian and Trump is a libertarian in terms of free speech because it suits him. But he's a neo-mercantilist, which means you need to use the power of the state to re-industrialize. You can't be a libertarian. There are no libertarian neo-mercantilists. There's a contradiction in terms. So that was always going to be a tension. And equally on the left wing and the Democrats, you have splits between the ones who would like to be moderate Republicans and the Bernie Sanders AOC wing and the people who are further left than them. Okay, that's a natural spectrum, but it's really starting to emerge. Europe's completely fragmented. In the UK, our two-party system, which we've had forever, is breaking down. All the parties are fragmenting between right and further right, centre and left and further left. Like the Green Party have gone extremely far left now, but present themselves with a different colour. And the key point I'm making is, with this confluence of issues, none of which have an easy solution, you can't logically even find a solution for all of them. There will have to be a trade-off. You might be able to solve A, B, C, but you screw the pooch on D and E. Or you can do E and A, but you can't do B and C. None of our political parties are A, cognizant of all the problems, and B, capable of expressing it to the populace, and then C, capable of saying, this is the trade-off. And that's why you're seeing all these political splits, this noise, this turbulence, which then feeds back through to financial markets, which I look at, because they can't deal with the complexity of the breadth and the scale of the multidimensional problems we're dealing with.
If you could, something you mentioned was my next question, and it's a bit esoteric for me, but mercantilism or neo-mercantilism. And someone that I follow, he's a German theologian, Dr. Martin Erdmann. He was supposed to be on the podcast some months back, but I had a heart attack, unfortunately, a few days before he was to come on, but he's recovering now. He's about to publish a brand new book, and he thinks this is one of the most important topics of our time. Like I said, I don't fully understand it. How important do you think, if you could just really quickly, tell us how important do you think this topic of neo-mercantilism is that the U.S. is going back to, and is that sort of basically the weapon that they're going to wield, as you've just described throughout this interview?
It's staggeringly important, and I'm not just saying that because I think, the first one in the markets to put a piece out saying Trump is a neo-mercantilist the day he was elected, and looking at all the different ways he would be, and the history of how the US has been, because the US has been a neo-mercantilist for most of its history. The post-World War II period, up until the post-Cold War period, was the exception to the rule. The US usually was neo-mercantilist. So let me just define it very quickly. Mercantilism, in the old form, was that countries didn't trust anyone else around them for very good reason. They wanted to keep all the gold, or usually silver, in their country. So money was circulating, so you had wealth, because metal was wealth. If you didn't have it, there was literally no money in people's pockets. You couldn't pay people. You couldn't hire mercenaries. You couldn't produce swords or guns or whatever. And the only way you could keep the money within the system, without an international banking system, was to run a trade surplus. Very simple balance sheet analysis. I run a trade surplus, money flows to me. Silver's in my pocket. It's not in your pocket. It's zero sum. And countries followed that rule in Europe for hundreds of years. And before that, in Asia, you go back to ancient China, ancient India, ancient Greece, they were all the variants of mercantilists. Trade was deeply political, deeply controlled. Some subsidies were highly subsidized because you needed them as an input to more value-added things you were going to do in order to run a trade surplus. So it wasn't, hey, just let the free market do what it wants. It was, what's good for Greece or Greek city-state, ABC, Inc. What's good for China, Inc., India, Inc. So we ran that for ages, and then we moved over to free trade when we, first of all, started to develop more of an international banking system, and globalization, as we understand it, started to begin. And everyone realized, well, actually, if everyone trades with each other and isn't zero sum and says, well, if you do well, I do well, and we all specialize just in a few things, which we're relatively or comparatively better at, mathematically, we push the productivity frontier, which is mathematically true. We produce more, we exchange it together, we're all better off, happy days. And that, of course, used to be the mantra in the British Empire, which used it, having industrialized first, to basically control the world at gunpoint, opening up country after country at gunpoint and saying, please remove all your what's good for us, Inc. controls and just buy from us. And of course, those countries didn't prosper. They just sold cheap stuff to the UK and had to buy British manufactured products. And the Americans initially were neo-mercantilists in rejection of the British, because otherwise America would have been a farm. What else would it have been? It had lots of land. It would have been a farm for the British. So it didn't. It industrialized by rejecting that advice. Alexander Hamilton being the first of many neo-mercantilists in the US, and built this mega industry, which of course World War II then took to the next level. After World War II, the US, and this is an enormous simplification of history, decided, okay, we are now going to change tack completely, and we're going to build a global free trade system similar to the British one. And we'll use free trade as a carrot. People can sell to us if they're our friends politically. We'll rebuild Europe using free trade, which is very generous of the US to do it. We'll fight the Soviets and the Chinese by doing that. And within that system, people will do better than they will in the other system. And they were right. They were right. They won the Cold War on that basis. And then we had the post-Cold War period. But what happened during that period was the US didn't say, okay, let's guardedly go back to a gentle neo-mercantilism or have a global deal where we understand what we're doing. The global deal was just, okay, let markets rip everywhere. And as I said, some countries like China said, okay, let's be neo-mercantilist. They run huge trade surpluses to develop. The US runs a huge trade deficit. You get inequality in China and massive inequality in the US, and deindustrialization. And the Pentagon starts to lose its supply chains and the whole system starts crumbling down. That's what we see now. So if the US is going to go back to neo-mercantilism, as I said, the whole global system has to change. You can't have free trade with everybody. You can't have free markets. And again, this is the Musk-Trump tension to a degree. You can't even just say, let's just slash the government deficit, because, okay, on one level, you need to do that. But if you do that and you create a crippling recession, which means you don't have the revenue or the growth within which to start to build a production base to rebuild things, to take on countries which have got a huge production base, you lose. So all the rules of the game in terms of how we do things change, because it's not what's good for markets, which is how things run now. It's not what's good for profits or good this quarter. It's what's good for America, Inc. And then you can have an argument about what does America, Inc. mean. But generally, as I said, it's the bottom deciles rather than the top. It's a more equal production or more equal distribution within US, relatively, not completely, but relatively. And it's more balanced trade with others. And that may have to be done at gunpoint, like, gunship diplomacy to a degree. That's how it was done from a position of strength in the past. Now it can be done from a position of weakness using the dollar or stable coins, etc., as I said, and Bitcoin, and or what's left of the Pentagon now before it gradually fades over time because they can't produce as fast as China or others, who have production. So that changes everything, everywhere, globally. And let me add just one more point, and I promise I'll finish, which is this. Most of what I see in terms of political debate internally in the countries I travel to, work in, have clients in, or friends and family in, they all have a left-right political divide. And it changes country by country, like how wide that is. But you understand the general spectrum. Left, the state controls everything, tax the rich. The right, let's get the state out of everyone's hair and cut taxes. We're deregulate everything. We're familiar with those two, right? That's two-dimensional thinking in the world I'm describing. Because if the state runs everything and you tax the rich, unless the state is going to be neo-mercantilist and say, we want to run a trade surplus, which culturally the left no longer does, because the culture of the left has changed. Now it's about diversity, open borders, immigration, etc., etc. That's the antithesis of neo-mercantilism. You're not thinking about your country doing the best it can do and running a trade surplus with everybody else and producing more. You're not. So that left no longer does it. And on the right, You've got the Elon Musk view, which is great. Okay, I love my country, fantastic, woo. Let's deregulate everything, cut taxes. The rich will take care of everything. They'll invest more. No, they won't. They'll go and invest in China. They'll go and invest anywhere else other than the US, and the jobs and the industry will go there. And again, your country doesn't do that well. So this spectrum doesn't solve the problem if it's all against all internationally. You have to go up the apex to neo-mercantilism, which is what's good for my country, Inc. Now, do you do that with policies from the right, deregulation? Yeah, maybe, but you're going to have some state control from the left. Do you do it and you don't care about who wins and loses? You can do. Or do you do it and care about, I want you to win less and you to win more so that you all rally behind the flag? Right, that's a more leftist position. And ultimately, my view for years has been this is what will have to emerge logically by default in an individual country or a cluster of countries or a bloc. Similar to what we were talking about, because it's the only logical response to the environment we're in. The alternative is literally to be 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 bald men arguing over a comb you don't have. Which, yeah, that can happen, but nothing good will come from it.
Well, it's been a whirlwind tour you've given us this hour. My final question for you would sort of be, I tend to ask most of my guests, if you have any general counsel for people listening, what can we, the individual do to sort of survive and thrive, to prepare for impact and do well in this environment?
Well, again, it depends where you sit on the spectrum. Some people want to get a Molotov cocktail. Some people want to get duct tape and shotguns and, go and buy a bunker. Others, and I would hope they would be the ones I'm talking to primarily, understand that this is a moment of flux and change. And what I can tell you again is from conversations right the way across the socioeconomic spectrum and the power spectrum, across different geographies, is very few people grasp the totality of what I'm describing here. And maybe it's been too much for viewers, and I apologize if I'm throwing things at you. But I think if you really reduce it down to the brass tacks that I have, it's not actually that difficult to grasp. The complexity is, but the fundamental principles aren't. But if you can understand that and do your own reading around it, and everyone's, of course, free to then disagree with me or find their own niche within that, talk to others about it. Talk to your friends, talk to your family, talk to your colleagues, talk to your industry, if you're in. Talk to your local representatives, because they don't understand it. And the more that they do, the more you can start to affect that change, because there is a vacuum of ideas out there right now, a vacuum of ideas. And that vacuum can either be filled with very bad ideas or very good ones. And we are all, I like to believe, to one degree powerless because we're just tiny individuals, but on the other, we can contribute to that, to filling that vacuum with, with positive momentum and positive thoughts and positive discussion. And I would hope that this discussion is just one grain of sand on that beach, but you can all be grains of sand.
You have a very optimistic and positive attitude, which is good. Listeners, sometimes we have guests that are more, including myself, a bit more doomer. But your links are all in the description. Where the best, anything you want to let us know about websites. I reckon your X account and Rabobank.com are the best places to follow you. Yes,
Rabobank knowledge. If you Google that, you do have to be a Rabobank client to get access to that. But for those who would like to become a client in the corporate space, please have a look there. I am on LinkedIn, although I don't do as much there as I have in the past. But I am also on X at the Michael Every, all one word. And I continue these kind of discussions there and chit chat about recent developments. And hopefully, those are just a starting base for others to continue to explore this topic. But I do think that neo-mercantilism is something we all need to be cognizant of. And I did just publish a recent report on that, which you will find on my X account.
All right. Well, again, a lot for people to digest here. Thank you for being on Geopolitics and Empire.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.